At a bustling island market where criminals and outcasts were sold like property, a small island girl stepped forward with nothing but a single gold coin. To everyone's shock, she used it to buy a towering pirate kept with a sack over his head, mocked as worthless and dangerous. The crowd had gathered to witness another day of human trading, expecting nothing more than the usual desperate transactions between slavers and ship captains, seeking cheap labor. But when the heavy burlap sack was removed from the giant's head, the entire marketplace fell silent. What she had claimed was not just another broken prisoner, but Captain Blackheart Morrison, the most feared pirate captain whose legend had been buried in chains for 5 long years. The girl's trembling hands had just purchased a storm that would shake the very foundations of the Caribbean. What could a child possibly want with the most dangerous man alive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silence stretched like a taut rope ready to snap. Captain Blackheart Morrison stood motionless, his massive frame casting shadows across the cobblestones as morning sunlight revealed features that had haunted merchant sailors' nightmares for decades. Deep scars crisscrossed his weathered face, and his dark eyes held the cold calculation of a man who had taken what he wanted from the sea and those who sailed upon it. His broken compass, once a magnificent navigation instrument crafted from brass and silver, hung from a chain around his neck. The glass face was cracked in a spiderweb pattern, its needle spinning uselessly, a fitting symbol of a legendary captain whose direction had been lost the moment iron shackles replaced the freedom of open waters. "Sweet mother of pearl," whispered an old fisherman, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the harbor. "That's really him. That's the Blackheart himself." The crowd began to murmur, a low rumble of recognition and fear that spread through the marketplace like wildfire. Mothers pulled their children close. Merchant sailors who had once trembled at mere mention of Morrison's name now stared at the chained giant with a mixture of fascination and terror. 5 years ago, Captain Morrison's flagship, the Iron Maiden, had ruled these waters with merciless efficiency. No merchant vessel was safe from his raids, no colonial governor's treasury secure from his midnight strikes. He had commanded a fleet of 7 ships and over 300 of the most ruthless cutthroats ever to sail the Caribbean. His reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by his apparent lack of mercy for those who crossed him. The capture had been legendary in its own right. 3 colonial navies had finally cornered Morrison during a hurricane off the coast of Jamaica. His ship was battered, his crew scattered, and his luck finally exhausted. The trial that followed was brief. His crimes were too numerous and too well documented to require lengthy deliberation. Death had been the expected sentence, but the colonial governors had chosen something they considered more fitting: a slow degradation in prison, followed by sale to the highest bidder for whatever brutal labor awaited. Now this slip of a girl, barely reaching Morrison's chest even when he was chained and kneeling, had claimed ownership of the most dangerous man in the Caribbean. Isabella Crown, though few in the crowd knew her name, stood with her chin raised defiantly as slave traders and government officials began shouting protests. Her threadbare dress and calloused hands marked her as one of the island's countless orphans, but her eyes burned with a determination that seemed far beyond her apparent years. "The transaction is invalid," declared Marcus Blackwood, the colonial administrator overseeing the market. "The children cannot purchase dangerous criminals. The prisoner will be returned to custody immediately." "I paid the asking price," Isabella replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "1 gold coin is posted. The sale is complete according to your own law." Morrison watched this exchange with growing interest. In 5 years of imprisonment, no one had shown the slightest interest in purchasing him. The colonial authorities had deliberately set his price at exactly 1 gold coin, an amount they assumed no one would waste on a chained pirate when healthy laborers could be bought for half the price. "The coin," Morrison spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Let me see it." Isabella hesitated, then held up the small disk of gold. It caught the sunlight, revealing intricate maritime symbols etched around its edges, symbols that Morrison recognized, despite the years that had passed since he'd last seen such craftsmanship. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone shifting from idle curiosity to sharp attention. "It belonged to my father," Isabella answered. It's all I have left of my family." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama unfolding beyond a simple slave transaction. Armed guards began pushing through the gathered spectators, their hands resting on sword hilts, as tension mounted between the defiant girl and the colonial officials determined to maintain order. Morrison studied Isabella's face with the same intensity he had once reserved for reading weather patterns and enemy ship movements. Something about her features stirred a memory he couldn't quite grasp. A familiarity that went beyond the ordinary resemblance that sometimes occurs between strangers. "Officials approach," he murmured, nodding toward the advancing guards. "If you truly own me, girl, then you'd better be prepared to collect your property quickly. They'll not allow this transaction to stand unchallenged." Isabella's grip tightened on the gold coin as she realized the gravity of her situation. She had planned for this moment for months, saving every penny and studying the market's procedures. But she hadn't fully considered what would happen after the purchase was complete. The guards were only 20 paces away when Isabella made her decision. She reached into the worn leather satchel hanging from her shoulder and withdrew a piece of parchment that had been folded and refolded. So many times the creases had worn white against the yellowed surface. "My name is Isabella Crown," she announced, loud enough for Morrison and the nearest spectators to hear. "My father was Thomas Crown, merchant captain of the vessel Prosperity. My mother was Elena Crown, daughter of the lighthouse keeper on Turtle Island." Morrison's expression shifted subtly, his eyes narrowing as he processed this information. The name Crown carried weight in these waters, though not always pleasant association. "5 years ago," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "pirates raided our family's trading post on San Miguel Island. They killed my parents, burned our home, and stole everything we had built over 3 generations. I was 7 years old, hidden in the root cellar, while my world burned above me." The maritime map she now unfolded had been her father's most prized possession, drawn on treated leather. It showed shipping routes and hidden anchorages throughout the Caribbean that only the most experienced captains knew. But more importantly, it contained her father's personal notations, cryptic marks and symbols that had taken Isabella years to begin understanding. "According to every witness who survived that night," she said, pointing directly at Morrison, "you led that raid. Your black flag was the last thing my father saw before they cut him down in his own warehouse." Morrison remained silent, but something flickered behind his eyes, surprise perhaps or recognition. "I've spent 5 learning everything I could about you, Captain Morrison. Where you sailed, how you fought, what treasures you took, and most importantly, where you might have hidden the gold and silver you stole from families like mine." Isabella traced her finger along a section of the map where several of her father's mysterious markings clustered around a small island that appeared to have no official name. The annotations were in her father's careful script, but they referenced coordinates and landmarks that only someone with intimate knowledge of Morrison's operations could have known. "My father was more than just a merchant," she explained, though she kept her voice low enough that only Morrison could hear clearly. "He was a man who paid attention to patterns, who kept detailed records of everything that happened in these waters. He suspected that someone with your reputation wouldn't simply scatter his stolen wealth randomly." Morrison leaned forward as much as his chains would allow, studying the map with professional interest. "Your father was Thomas Crown of the Prosperity," he said slowly. "I remember that name." "Then you remember killing him." "I remember many things, girl. Some of them might surprise you." The guards had pushed through the crowd and were now close enough that Isabella could see the sweat staining their blue uniforms. She quickly refolded the map and secured it in her satchel, but not before Morrison had gotten a good look at her father's careful notations. "The treasure you stole from my family included more than just gold and silver," Isabella said urgently. "My father had been collecting ancient artifacts from indigenous tribes throughout the Caribbean. pieces that were worth more than their weight in precious metals because of their historical significance. Morrison's broken compass caught the light as he shifted his position, and Isabella noticed for the first time how his fingers unconsciously protected the damaged instrument. Even in chains, even after years of imprisonment, he still carried the tools of his former profession. "If you want to see your family's treasure again," Morrison said quietly, "you'll need more than that map and a single gold coin. You'll need someone who knows these waters better than the fish that swim in them. That's why I bought you. And what makes you think I'll help the daughter of a man I supposedly murdered?" Isabella met his gaze without flinching. "Because I'm offering you something you want more than anything else in the world. You're free to help me find what you stole from my family, and I'll make sure you never see the inside of a prison again." The guards were close enough now that their leader was shouting orders to disperse the crowd. Isabella could see colonial officials hurrying toward them from the government building, their faces grim with the determination of men who would not allow their authority to be challenged by a child. Morrison studied Isabella's face with the calculating expression of someone weighing risks against potential rewards. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Isabella Crown." "Perhaps both," she admitted. "But I'm also right about the treasure, and you know it." "The guards approach," Morrison observed. "Time for talk grows short." Isabella glanced around desperately, realizing that her carefully planned purchase was about to be invalidated by force. She had prepared for this moment, but the reality of facing armed colonial guards was more intimidating than her imagination had suggested. Morrison's chains rattled as he shifted his weight, and Isabella noticed something she hadn't seen before. His massive hands, scarred from years of rope work and sword fighting, moved with subtle precision as he adjusted his position. What she had initially taken for uncomfortable fidgeting was actually deliberate manipulation of the iron shackles around his wrists. "Girl," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying an urgency that made Isabella lean closer. "In approximately 30 seconds, these chains will no longer be a problem. When that happens, you'll need to follow my instructions exactly, without question or hesitation. Do you understand?" Isabella's eyes widened as she watched Morrison's fingers work with practiced efficiency. Hidden within the tattered fabric of his prison shirt were thin metal implements that looked like they had been carefully crafted from scavenged material. Lockpicks, she realized with amazement, tools he had somehow concealed through 5 years of imprisonment. "How did you—" Questions later, Morrison interrupted. "Listen carefully. When I stand, we move directly toward the harbor, not the main wharf where the naval ships dock, but the fishing pier on the eastern side. There's a small boat tied there with blue canvas covering its cargo. The owner is a man named Diego Santos, and he owes me a considerable debt." The approaching guards were now close enough that Isabella could hear their individual conversations. The colonial administrator, Marcus Blackwood, was pointing in their direction while issuing rapid commands to subordinates who looked increasingly nervous about confronting the legendary pirate. "Why should I trust you?" Isabella whispered. Morrison's hands went still for a moment, and he looked at her with an expression that seemed almost paternal. "Because, Isabella Crown, daughter of Thomas and Elena, your survival and mine are now connected by more than just a single gold coin. And because—" he paused, his scarred features softening slightly. "Because I knew your father better than you realize, and I owe his memory more than you could possibly understand." Before Isabella could process the implications of that statement, Morrison's chains fell away from his wrists with barely a whisper of sound. 5 years of captivity had not dulled his skills or weakened his resolve. He rose to his full, imposing height, like a mountain emerging from morning mist. The crowd's reaction was immediate and electric. Screams erupted from several directions as people realized that Captain Blackheart Morrison was no longer restrained. The guards who had been approaching with confident authority suddenly found themselves facing a free and dangerous adversary. "Now," Morrison commanded, grasping Isabella's hand with surprising gentleness. "Stay close and follow exactly in my footsteps." They moved through the panicking crowd like a shark cutting through a school of fish. Morrison's reputation preceded him so effectively that people threw themselves out of his path before he even approached. Isabella found herself running to keep up with his long strides, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. Behind them, the guards were shouting conflicting orders while trying to organize a pursuit. Some called for the harbor to be sealed. Others demanded reinforcements from the naval garrison. The chaos worked in Morrison and Isabella's favor as confused officials struggled to coordinate their response. Morrison led them through a maze of narrow alleys between warehouses and merchant shops, his knowledge of the island's layout showing that he had not wasted his years of imprisonment. He had been observing, planning, and preparing for exactly this opportunity. The boat, Isabella gasped as they emerged onto the fishing pier. How do you know it will be there? Diego Santos has used the same mooring spot for 15 years. Morrison replied, scanning the small vessels tied to the weathered dock, and his loyalty, once earned, doesn't waver with changing political winds. They found the boat exactly where Morrison had predicted, a sturdy fishing vessel with blue canvas stretched over its central compartment. Morrison untied the mooring lines with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent decades working with ropes and rigging. Diego, he called toward a weathered man emerging from a nearby shack. I'm calling in that favor from Port Royal. The fisherman's eyes widened with recognition, but he nodded without hesitation. Take her, Captain. She's fueled and provisioned for a week at sea. As they pushed off from the pier, Isabella could hear the sound of pursuing guards growing closer. The colonial authorities had finally organized their response, but Morrison had calculated their escape with the same tactical precision that had once made him the most feared pirate in the Caribbean. Where are we going? Isabella asked as Morrison took control of the boat's wheel. Morrison's broken compass caught the sunlight as he pulled it from his shirt, studying its useless spinning needle with what appeared to be genuine affection. To find answers that have been waiting 5 years to be discovered. Isabella Crown, and perhaps to learn whether the daughter of Thomas Crown has inherited her father's courage, along with his map. The abandoned lighthouse stood like a weathered sentinel against the darkening sky, its broken lens catching the last rays of sunset as Morrison guided their stolen boat into a hidden cove on the island's eastern shore. Isabella had suggested this refuge, remembering stories her mother had told about the old lighthouse keeper who had once been her grandfather. The structure was more solid than it appeared from a distance. Built from local stone and designed to withstand Caribbean hurricanes, it had served as both navigation aid and family home for 3 generations before newer technology made it obsolete. Now it provided exactly what they needed: shelter, concealment, and time to negotiate the terms of their unlikely partnership. Inside the lighthouse's main chamber, Isabella lit an oil lamp she had hidden during previous visits. The warm glow revealed a space that had been prepared for exactly this moment. Supplies were carefully arranged on wooden shelves: dried foods, fresh water, basic medical supplies, and most importantly, additional maps and documents that Isabella had accumulated during her years of research. Morrison examined their surroundings with the critical eye of someone who understood that survival often depended on proper preparation. You've been planning this for quite some time, he observed, noting the organization and quality of the supplies. 5 years, Isabella confirmed, settling onto a wooden crate that served as both chair and storage. Ever since I realized that buying your freedom was the only way to get the information I needed. She reached into a satchel and withdrew a small silver locket, its surface tarnished with age, but still bearing the intricate engravings that marked it as a piece of fine craftsmanship. When she opened it, the lamplight revealed a miniature portrait of a woman with Isabella's dark eyes and determined expression. This was my mother's, she said, holding the locket so Morrison could see both the portrait and the inscription etched inside the lid. She gave it to me the night before the raid. Said it would help me remember who I was, no matter what happened. Morrison leaned forward to examine the locket more closely, and Isabella noticed his expression change as he read the inscription. The words were in Spanish, but their meaning seemed to resonate with him in a way that suggested more than casual recognition. Elena Maria Santos, he read aloud. Daughter of the lighthouse, keeper of the flame. You knew my mother too? Isabella asked, surprised by the certainty in his voice. Morrison settled back against the lighthouse wall, his massive frame somehow managing to look both dangerous and contemplative in the flickering lamplight. Your mother was Elena Santos before she married your father. Diego Santos, the fisherman who helped us escape, is her cousin. The family connections in these islands run deeper than outsiders realize. Isabella stared at him, processing this revelation. That's how you knew about the boat. That's how you knew Diego would help us. Among other things, yes. Morrison's scarred hands moved with surprising gentleness as he gestured toward the locket. Your mother was known throughout these waters for her kindness to sailors and her skill at treating injuries. She saved the lives of dozens of men, including some who sailed under my flag. Pirates, men who chose the sea over the land, for reasons that weren't always entirely criminal. Morrison's voice carried a weight that suggested personal experience with such choices. Your mother never asked questions about a man's past. When he needed medical attention, she judged people by their actions in the present, not their reputations from years gone by. Isabella closed the locket carefully, her understanding of her family's history expanding in ways she hadn't expected. If you knew my parents, if my mother helped your men, then why did you raid our trading post? Why did you kill them? Morrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the broken compass that still hung around his neck. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a gravity that seemed to come from deep personal pain. I didn't kill your parents, Isabella. I arrived too late to save them, but I was not the one who ordered their deaths. But the witnesses saw my ship in the harbor after the deed was done, saw my flag flying as I pursued the real killers into open water. Morrison met her gaze directly. Your father sent a message before he died, a single word carried by a seabird, to my ship. Betrayal. Isabella felt the ground shifting beneath her carefully constructed understanding of the past. If you didn't kill them, then who did? Morrison reached into his shirt and withdrew a folded piece of paper that had been hidden close to his skin. The document was official colonial correspondence, bearing seals and signatures that marked it as genuine government communication. The same men who arranged for my capture 6 months later, he said, handing her the paper. The same men who wanted your father silenced because he had discovered their illegal activities and who wanted me eliminated because I had learned too much about their operation. Isabella unfolded the document with trembling hands, her eyes widening as she read the official orders that detailed a coordinated plan to eliminate both her family and Morrison's organization through carefully orchestrated violence that would be blamed on pirate activities. As dawn broke over the lighthouse, Morrison led Isabella down a hidden path that wound through dense tropical vegetation to what appeared to be nothing more than a pile of weathered rocks near the shoreline. But when he moved aside a carefully camouflaged stone slab, a concealed cache was revealed beneath. The hiding place contained supplies that spoke of careful long-term planning, weapons wrapped in oiled cloth, navigational instruments protected from salt air, and most significantly, a curved dagger with intricate engravings that seemed to come alive in the morning light. The blade itself was nearly a foot long, crafted from steel that had been folded and reforged multiple times to create patterns that resembled flowing water. The serpent's tooth, Morrison said, as he lifted the weapon with reverence. I had this made by a master smith in Port Royal 15 years ago. Every detail was designed for both function and meaning. Isabella watched as he tested the blade's balance, his movements flowing with the natural grace of someone who had spent decades mastering the art of swordplay. The engravings along the blade's fuller depicted scenes of maritime life, ships navigating stormy seas, sea creatures rising from ocean depths, and symbols that seemed to tell a story she couldn't quite decipher. It's beautiful, she admitted, though she remained wary of anything that made Morrison more dangerous than he already was. It's practical, Morrison corrected, sliding the dagger into a leather sheath that had been waiting in the cache. But yes, it's also beautiful. A man spends enough time at sea, he learns to appreciate craftsmanship that combines purpose with artistry. From the cache, Morrison also retrieved additional supplies that demonstrated the extent of his preparation for this eventual escape. Clothing that would allow him to move through colonial settlements without immediately attracting attention, currency in various forms that would be accepted throughout the Caribbean, and most importantly, documents that would provide them with legitimate passage between islands. "How long have you been planning this?" Isabella asked as she watched him systematically inventory the supplies. "Since the day they chained me," Morrison replied without hesitation. "A man doesn't survive in these waters by accepting defeat simply because circumstances turn against him temporarily." Among the supplies was a collection of letters tied with cord, correspondence that Morrison had apparently maintained even during his imprisonment, through networks that Isabella was only beginning to understand. The letters bore postmarks from ports throughout the Caribbean, and were addressed to names that meant nothing to her, but seemed to carry significant weight for Morrison. "Allies," he explained when he noticed her examining the correspondence. "Men and women who remember favors given and debts owed. The colonial authorities assumed that 5 years of imprisonment would erase my connections. But loyalty isn't so easily destroyed when it's based on mutual respect, rather than fear." Morrison selected several of the letters and handed them to Isabella. "Read these. They contain information that will help you understand what we're truly facing." The first letter was from a merchant captain who described increased colonial military activity around several islands that appeared on Isabella's father's map. The second contained reports of government officials conducting unusual searches of private properties, apparently looking for something specific. The third letter was more disturbing. It described the disappearance of several people who had been asking questions about events from 5 years ago. "They're still looking for something," Isabella realized as she finished reading. "Something they believe your organization took during the raids. Something your father discovered and documented before his death." Morrison confirmed. "Something valuable enough that they've spent 5 years searching for it." From the bottom of the cache, Morrison withdrew a small but seaworthy boat that had been disassembled and carefully stored. The vessel was designed for speed and stealth rather than comfort, built from lightweight materials that would allow it to outrun larger ships in favorable conditions. "We'll need this for the next phase of our journey," Morrison said as he began examining the boat's components. "The fishing vessel we borrowed was adequate for escaping the island, but what we're planning requires something more specialized." Isabella helped him carry the boat components to the water's edge, marveling at the engineering that had gone into creating something so compact yet functional. As they worked together to assemble the vessel, she found herself reassessing her opinion of Morrison's character. His preparation spoke of patience and intelligence rather than the mindless brutality she had attributed to him for 5 years. "Captain Morrison," she said as they fitted the boat's sail into position, "if you're telling the truth about my parents' death, if you really tried to save them, then I owe you an apology." Morrison paused in his work, meeting her gaze with an expression that seemed almost paternal. "You owe me nothing, Isabella Crown. You acted on the information available to you, and you had the courage to take action when action was required. Your parents would be proud of the woman you've become." Their small vessel cut through Caribbean waters under star-filled skies, the gentle rhythm of waves against the hull providing a steady backdrop to Morrison's voice as he began sharing stories. Isabella had never heard, with the immediate danger of pursuit behind them. The captain seemed transformed from the chained prisoner she had purchased into someone entirely different, a man with depth, intelligence, and surprisingly, genuine remorse. From his weathered sea bag, Morrison withdrew a leather-bound journal that had somehow survived 5 years of imprisonment. The pages were filled with careful handwriting in multiple languages, chronicling not just navigation notes and weather observations, but also personal reflections that revealed a side of the infamous pirate that contradicted every story Isabella had heard. "I began writing this during my 2nd year in prison," Morrison explained, opening the journal to pages that contained sketches of ships, maps of coastlines, and what appeared to be poetry written in a careful, educated hand. "Solitude has a way of forcing a man to confront truths he might otherwise avoid. Isabella leaned closer in the lamplight, reading entries that spoke of regret, responsibility, and a growing understanding of the pain his actions had caused to innocent people. One entry, dated 3 years earlier, mentioned her parents specifically, Thomas and Elena Crown. She read aloud, "Their deaths weigh heavily on my conscience, not because I caused them directly, but because my reputation provided cover for those who did. I have become a convenient shadow for men whose corruption exceeds anything I ever contemplated during my worst moments." Morrison nodded gravely. "Your father was investigating a network of colonial officials who were using pirate raids as cover for their own criminal activity. They would arrange for merchant ships to be attacked, then claim the stolen goods through their official positions while blaming everything on men like me. But you were a real pirate," Isabella pointed out. "You did attack ships and steal cargo." "True," Morrison admitted without attempting to minimize his past. "But I followed certain rules, certain codes that these officials ignored completely. I never attacked ships carrying families, I never killed unnecessarily, and I never stole from people who couldn't afford the loss." Isabella studied his face in the lamplight, searching for signs of deception, but finding only what appeared to be genuine pain. "Then why did your reputation become so fierce?" Morrison turned several pages in his journal, revealing detailed drawings of ships and battle tactics that demonstrated considerable strategic intelligence. "Because fear was a more effective weapon than violence. If merchant captains believed that resistance was futile, they would surrender without bloodshed. My reputation for invincibility saved more lives than it cost." The journal contained correspondence Morrison had maintained with various contacts throughout the Caribbean, including several letters from people Isabella recognized as respected members of island communities. A doctor who thanked Morrison for protecting his medical supply shipment. A school teacher whose salary had been mysteriously supplemented during hard times. A widow whose fishing boat had been repaired overnight by unknown benefactors. "I don't understand," Isabella said, confused by these revelations that contradicted everything she thought she knew. "If you were helping people, why did the colonial authorities want you eliminated?" "Because I was becoming too powerful, too independent," Morrison explained. "My fleet controlled trade routes that the colonial governments wanted to monopolize. More importantly, I was beginning to ask questions about official activities that couldn't bear scrutiny." Morrison showed her a section of the journal that contained detailed observations about patterns in colonial shipping and taxation that suggested systematic fraud involving millions of pieces of eight. Her father's name appeared frequently in these notes, identified as someone who had noticed the same irregularities from his position as a legitimate merchant. Thomas Crown was an honest man operating in a system designed to reward dishonesty. Morrison continued. "When he began documenting evidence of official corruption, he became a threat that had to be eliminated. The same corruption that ultimately led to my own downfall." Isabella felt her understanding of the past shifting again, like sand being reshaped by incoming tides. "So the raid on our trading post was specifically designed to kill my father and steal his evidence, and to implicate me in the process, removing 2 threats to their operations simultaneously." Morrison confirmed. "Your father managed to send me warning before he died, but I arrived too late to save him or your mother. The real killers escaped while I fought to save what remained of your family's property." The journal's final entries were more recent, written during Morrison's imprisonment and focusing on plans for eventual freedom and justice. Isabella's name appeared in several entries, along with observations about her growth and character that suggested Morrison had been watching over her from a distance, even while chained. "You've been protecting me," Isabella realized. "Even from prison you've been making sure I stayed safe." Morrison closed the journal carefully. "I owed your parents a debt that 5 years of imprisonment couldn't erase. Ensuring your survival was the least I could do to honor their memory." The first sign of trouble came from Morrison's weather glass, an antique barometric instrument that had been his grandfather's and had sailed with him through countless voyages. The mercury column was dropping with alarming speed, while the ornate brass housing revealed intricate engravings that depicted various weather patterns around its circumference. "We have perhaps 2 hours before this becomes very unpleasant," Morrison announced, tapping the glass face and watching the mercury continue its precipitous fall. "The instrument has never failed me in 30 years of sailing these waters." Isabella looked at the seemingly calm seas around them, noting only gentle swells and a pleasant breeze that had been pushing them steadily toward their destination. "It doesn't look like storm weather. Caribbean storms can develop with terrifying speed," Morrison explained, adjusting their course toward a small island that appeared as little more than a dark smudge on the horizon. "The barometer reads changes in atmospheric pressure that human senses can't detect until it's too late to seek shelter." As if summoned by his words, the western sky began showing the first hints of the approaching tempest. What had been wispy clouds an hour earlier were now building into towering formations that seemed to pulse with internal energy. The wind, which had been steady and predictable, began shifting direction and intensity in ways that made their small sail flutter uncertainly. Morrison's weather glass proved accurate in its grim predictions. Within an hour, the approaching storm revealed itself as a massive system that darkened half the sky and turned the sea into a churning cauldron of wind-driven waves. Rain began falling in sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards, while lightning illuminated the chaos with brief, terrifying glimpses of mountainous swells. "Stay low and hold tight to the boat's frame," Morrison shouted over the increasing wind. "Don't try to help with the sailing unless I specifically tell you. This will require every bit of experience I possess." Isabella huddled in the boat's small shelter area, watching in amazement as Morrison seemed to transform into an extension of the vessel itself. His movements were fluid and precise despite the chaotic motion of the storm, adjusting sail and rudder with timing that appeared almost supernatural. The broken compass around his neck might have been useless for navigation, but his knowledge of sea and weather was functioning perfectly. The storm tested every aspect of their small craft's construction, and Morrison's seamanship. Waves that seemed impossibly large crashed over the bow, filling the boat with water faster than their small pump could remove it. Isabella found herself bailing frantically, while Morrison fought to keep them oriented properly to the swells. "There," Morrison called, pointing toward a barely visible shoreline through the rain and spray. "Small island, protected cove on the leeward side. We can ride this out if we can reach the beach." The final approach to safety was the most dangerous part of their ordeal. Surf breaking over hidden rocks created a maze of obstacles that had to be navigated while waves threatened to drive them onto the very shore they were trying to reach safely. Morrison's knowledge of Caribbean coastal conditions proved essential as he found the narrow channel that led to calmer water. They dragged their battered boat onto a small beach just as the storm reached its full fury. The island's vegetation provided some protection from the wind, while a small cave offered shelter from the driving rain that now fell so heavily it seemed like a vertical river. "Your weather glass saved our lives," Isabella said, as they huddled in the cave, waiting for the storm to pass. The instrument had been damaged during their ordeal, its brass housing dented and its glass cracked, but it had provided the warning that made survival possible. Morrison examined the damaged barometer with obvious affection. "It belonged to my grandfather, who was a legitimate merchant captain before the family fortunes changed. He taught me that the sea demands respect above all else, and that survival often depends on listening to warnings that pride might otherwise ignore." The storm raged through the night, giving them time to rest and recover from their ordeal. Isabella found herself studying Morrison with new appreciation as she watched him methodically check their supplies and assess the damage to their equipment. His competence in crisis situations was undeniable, but more importantly, she was beginning to trust his judgment about larger matters as well. "Captain Morrison," she said as the storm finally began to subside, "I believe I owe you another apology. Not just about my parents, but about assuming that your reputation told the complete story about who you are." Morrison looked up from his examination of their damaged sail, his weathered face showing surprise at her words. "And I owe you thanks, Isabella Crown, for having the courage to purchase my freedom when freedom seemed impossible. We've both learned things about each other that neither expected." When morning broke, clear and calm after the storm's fury, Isabella and Morrison found themselves on an island that seemed untouched by the modern world. Ancient stone carvings emerged from the jungle vegetation as they explored, revealing intricate symbols that predated European colonization by centuries. The Taino stonework showed sophisticated astronomical knowledge and artistic skill that spoke of a complex civilization. "These markings," Isabella said, studying the carved symbols that spiraled around a large boulder near the island's center, "they're similar to some of the notations on my father's map." Morrison examined the carvings with obvious familiarity, tracing patterns with his finger while explaining their significance. The indigenous peoples of these islands possessed knowledge that most Europeans never bothered to learn. They understood weather patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal changes in ways that could mean the difference between life and death for anyone trying to navigate these waters. The stone carvings depicted scenes of maritime activity that showed the Taino people as accomplished sailors and traders. Ships with distinctive sail configurations were shown traveling between islands, while other panels illustrated astronomical observations that allowed for precise navigation. Most intriguingly, several carvings seemed to reference locations that appeared on Isabella's father's treasure map. "Your father spent considerable time studying indigenous history," Morrison continued, pointing to specific symbols that matched markings on Thomas Crown's carefully annotated charts. He believed that understanding the original inhabitants' knowledge was essential for anyone who wanted to truly comprehend these islands' secrets. As they followed a path marked by additional stone markers, they encountered an elderly man tending a small garden in a clearing that had been carved from the jungle with obvious care and skill. The hermit appeared to be of mixed indigenous and European heritage, his weathered features suggesting a lifetime spent in harmony with the island's natural rhythms. "I wondered when you would arrive, Captain Morrison," the man said without surprise, as if he had been expecting their visit for years. "And you must be Isabella Crown, daughter of Thomas and Elena. You have your mother's eyes and your father's determination." Isabella stared at the hermit in amazement. "How do you know who we are?" "Because your father visited this island many times during his investigations," the hermit replied, introducing himself as Miguel Santos, another member of the extended family network that seemed to connect throughout the Caribbean. "He shared my interest in preserving the knowledge of the people who lived here before the conquistadors arrived." Miguel led them to his simple dwelling, a structure that combined traditional indigenous building techniques with practical modern improvement. Inside, he maintained a collection of artifacts and documents that represented decades of careful preservation work. Maps, tools, pottery, and most importantly, written records that documented historical events from perspectives that official colonial histories had ignored. "Your father discovered that the indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated methods for hiding valuable items from Spanish treasure hunters," Miguel explained, showing them detailed drawings of concealment techniques that had protected sacred objects for centuries. The same methods were later adapted by people who needed to hide things from colonial authorities. Isabella studied the documentation with growing excitement, recognizing patterns that connected to her father's research. The treasure locations on his map, they're based on indigenous knowledge about natural hiding places. "Precisely," Miguel confirmed. "But your father also discovered something else. The colonial officials who killed him weren't just stealing gold and silver. They were systematically destroying indigenous cultural sites to cover their tracks and eliminate evidence of their activities." Morrison's expression darkened as he examined documents that detailed environmental destruction on a scale that went far beyond simple treasure hunting. They're erasing history itself to hide their crimes. Miguel showed them a map that revealed the full extent of the destruction, with dozens of archaeological sites marked as having been damaged or destroyed during the past 5 years. The pattern suggested a coordinated campaign to eliminate any evidence that might support indigenous land claims or expose illegal colonial activities. This is why they wanted your father silenced, Miguel explained to Isabella. His documentation of these sites represented a threat to land grants and mining concessions that had been obtained through fraud. If indigenous peoples could prove their historical connection to these lands, the entire colonial economy would be threatened, Isabella finished, understanding the stakes involved. This isn't just about stolen treasure, it's about legitimacy and power on a massive scale. Miguel reached into a wooden chest and withdrew a document that made both Isabella and Morrison lean forward with intense interest. It was an official Spanish colonial paper, signed and sealed, that granted specific mining rights to Thomas Crown based on his archaeological research and indigenous land documentation. Your father's treasure wasn't just gold and silver, Miguel revealed. It was legal proof of indigenous land rights that could overturn decades of colonial theft and corruption. Miguel disappeared into the back of his dwelling and returned with a document that would change everything Isabella thought she knew about her parents' death. The Spanish colonial paper was yellowed with age, but bore official seals and signatures that marked it as genuine legal documentation from the highest levels of colonial administration. I was there that night, Miguel said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a secret he had held for 5 years. Hidden in the mangroves near your family's trading post when the attack began. I saw everything that happened. Isabella's hands trembled as she took the document, scanning Spanish text that her father had taught her to read during their long evenings studying maritime history together. The official paper was a detailed witness statement, signed by Miguel and notarized by a colonial magistrate who had since fled the Caribbean under mysterious circumstances. According to this, Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper, the men who killed my parents were wearing colonial military uniforms, not pirate clothing. Morrison read over her shoulder, his expression growing darker as he absorbed the implications of Miguel's testimony. They came in small boats flying false flags, led by Lieutenant Commander Marcus Blackwood, the same man who tried to prevent your purchase of me at the slave market. The document contained details that painted a picture of calculated murder rather than random piracy. The attackers had known exactly where Thomas Crown kept his research materials, had systematically destroyed specific documents while ignoring valuable trade goods, and had executed both parents when they refused to reveal the location of their complete archaeological records. Your father fought bravely, Miguel continued, his eyes distant with painful memory. He delayed them long enough for your mother to hide you in the root cellar and for me to witness their identities. But they were too many, and they had come prepared for violence. Morrison's broken compass caught the lamplight as he leaned forward to study a specific section of Miguel's testimony. The document mentions that I arrived approximately 2 hours after the attack began. What exactly did you see when my ship appeared? Miguel's weathered face showed relief at finally being able to share the complete truth. Captain Morrison's vessel appeared just as Lieutenant Commander Blackwood was loading stolen documents onto his boat. Morrison's men engaged the real killers in battle, while Morrison himself searched the burning buildings for survivors. Isabella felt tears she had held back for 5 years finally beginning to flow as Miguel's account continued. Morrison found your parents' bodies and spent precious time ensuring they received proper treatment before pursuing Blackwood's forces. His delay in giving chase probably allowed the real killers to escape, but it showed respect for the dead that no genuine pirate would have demonstrated. The testimony revealed that Morrison had actually saved several island residents during the attack, evacuating people to safety aboard his ship before engaging in pursuit of the colonial forces responsible for the massacre. His black flag had been visible to other witnesses, creating the impression that pirates had been present. But Miguel's detailed account showed that Morrison had been responding to the attack rather than leading it. Why didn't you come forward with this information sooner? Isabella asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Because Lieutenant Commander Blackwood returned the next week with a full military escort and threats against anyone who might contradict the official version of events. Miguel replied, 3 other witnesses disappeared permanently. I survived only because I fled to this island and remained hidden. Morrison studied the document's official seals and signatures with the careful attention of someone who understood colonial bureaucracy. This testimony would be sufficient to clear my name and expose the real conspiracy, but only if presented to authorities who aren't part of the corruption. There's more, Miguel said, producing additional papers from his collection. Your father managed to send me copies of his research before he died, including maps and documents that prove indigenous land rights throughout the Caribbean. The legal implications extend far beyond your family's case. Isabella examined her father's research with new understanding of its significance. Thomas Crown had been documenting not just archaeological sites, but also legal precedents that could support indigenous peoples' claims to lands that had been illegally seized through fraud and violence. His work represented a threat to the entire colonial economic system. Lieutenant Commander Blackwood and his associates have spent 5 years searching for these documents. Miguel explained, they know that your father made copies, and they suspect that someone in his family might have inherited the complete records. Morrison's expression became grimly determined, which means that Isabella has been in danger since the moment she publicly identified herself at the slave market. Blackwood now knows she's alive and actively seeking the truth. The weight of their situation settled over Isabella like a heavy cloak as she realized that purchasing Morrison's freedom had exposed her to the same forces that had killed her parents. The glint of sunlight on a distant spyglass confirmed Morrison's worst fears as he scanned the horizon from Miguel's highest vantage point. The ornate telescope belonged to Captain Red Jack Meridian, Morrison's former first mate, whose betrayal had led directly to Morrison's capture 5 years earlier. The distinctive brass fittings and carved ivory details made the instrument unmistakable to someone who had once considered Red Jack a trusted brother-in-arms. He's found us, Morrison announced grimly, lowering his own smaller telescope as he counted the sails approaching from the northeast. 3 ships flying merchant colors, but moving in military formation. Red Jack always was better at deception than honest seamanship. Isabella climbed to join Morrison on the rocky outcrop, accepting his telescope to see for herself the approaching threat. Through the lens she could make out the lead vessel's figurehead, a carved woman with flowing red hair that gave Captain Meridian his nickname. The ship was larger and more heavily armed than anything she had expected to face. How did he find us so quickly? Isabella asked, though she dreaded the answer. Morrison's expression darkened with bitter recognition. Because I taught him everything he knows about tracking prey across open water. Red Jack was my student before he became my betrayer. He understands my methods, my preferred routes, even my emergency procedures. Miguel emerged from his dwelling carrying supplies hastily gathered for their immediate departure. There's a hidden cove on the island's western shore, he said urgently. Your boat can be launched from there without being visible to approaching ships, but you'll need to leave within the hour. As they prepared for hasty departure, Morrison shared the painful history of his relationship with Red Jack Meridian. They had served together aboard merchant vessels before turning to piracy, had developed innovative tactical approaches that made their combined fleet nearly unstoppable, and had sworn oaths of loyalty that Morrison had believed would last until death. The betrayal came during what should have been our greatest triumph, Morrison explained as they loaded essential supplies into their small boat. We had captured intelligence about a Spanish treasure fleet carrying enough gold to set up our entire crew for life. But Red Jack had been secretly negotiating with colonial authorities, offering to deliver me in exchange for a full pardon and a privateering commission. Isabella listened with growing understanding of the personal pain behind Morrison's imprisonment. He sold you to save himself. Worse than that, Morrison replied, his scarred hands working efficiently, despite the obvious emotional weight of his memories. He used our planned attack on the treasure fleet as the perfect opportunity to spring his trap. My loyal crew members were killed or captured, while Red Jack escaped with both the Spanish gold and colonial approval for his treachery. Through Miguel's spyglass, they could now see Red Jack's ship clearly enough to make out individual crew members moving about the deck. The vessel showed signs of recent success, fresh paint, new rigging, and the confident movements of sailors who had grown accustomed to victory. Most ominously, gun ports were visible along the ship's sides, indicating military-grade armament that would make direct confrontation suicidal. Captain Meridian has become everything I once opposed, Morrison continued with disgust. He attacks defenseless merchants while flying colonial colors, claims legitimacy while practicing the worst forms of piracy, and has grown wealthy by serving masters who care nothing for the codes that once governed our actions. Miguel provided them with additional intelligence about Red Jack's recent activities, gathered through the same network that had kept Morrison informed during his imprisonment. The reports painted a picture of systematic brutality that exceeded anything Morrison had practiced during his worst days as a pirate captain. Meridian has been searching for you since news of your escape reached colonial authorities, Miguel warned. But his interest isn't just personal revenge. The colonial officials who originally hired him have promised additional rewards for recovering the documents your father gathered. Isabella, as they prepared to launch their boat from the hidden cove, Morrison made a decision that surprised Isabella with its strategic boldness. Instead of simply fleeing, he began planning an approach that would use Red Jack's overconfidence against him. Your former first mate expects you to run, Isabella observed as she helped push their boat into deeper water, which is exactly why we're going to do something he won't anticipate, Morrison replied, his tactical mind already working through possibilities that seemed impossible to someone with less experience. Red Jack's greatest weakness was always his assumption that he was the smartest person in any situation. 5 years of success have probably made that weakness even more pronounced. Isabella settled into the boat as Morrison took control of the sail, his movements showing the same fluid confidence she had witnessed during the storm. Despite the approaching danger, she found herself trusting his judgment with a certainty that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. As their small boat approached the coordinates marked on Thomas Crown's map, Morrison shared the complete legend of the treasure they sought. At its center was the heart of Montezuma, an emerald of impossible size and clarity that had been carved by Aztec artisans into the shape of a human heart. According to ancient texts that Isabella's father had studied, the stone possessed not just immense monetary value, but also symbolic power that connected the indigenous peoples of the entire Caribbean region. The Spanish conquistadors never found it, Morrison explained, as he guided their vessel between coral reefs that guarded the approach to their destination. When Cortés conquered the Aztec Empire, priests managed to smuggle the heart of Montezuma out of Tenochtitlan before the city fell. It traveled through networks of indigenous traders until it reached these islands, where it was hidden using knowledge that predated European arrival by centuries. Isabella studied her father's notations with new appreciation for the complexity of his research. Thomas Crown had spent years tracing references to the heart of Montezuma through Spanish colonial records, indigenous oral traditions, and archaeological evidence that painted a picture of resistance and preservation that most historians had overlooked. My father believed the emerald was more than just treasure, Isabella said, reading from his careful annotations. He thought it represented proof of sophisticated indigenous civilization that could challenge European claims of cultural superiority, which is exactly why colonial authorities wanted his research destroyed, Morrison replied. The heart of Montezuma doesn't just represent wealth. It represents legitimacy, history, and the right of indigenous peoples to reclaim lands that were stolen through fraud and violence. Their destination emerged from morning mist, like something from mythology. The volcanic island rose sharply from deep water, its slopes covered with vegetation that suggested centuries of undisturbed growth. Hidden coves and natural harbors provided perfect concealment for the kind of treasure cache that would require both secrecy and accessibility for those who knew the proper approach. According to your father's research, Morrison continued, the heart of Montezuma was combined with other treasures over the centuries. Spanish gold taken from conquistadors, pirate hoards accumulated through decades of successful raids, and indigenous artifacts that were hidden to preserve them from destruction. As they navigated toward a concealed entrance that appeared as nothing more than a gap between towering rock formations, Isabella noticed signs that other vessels had recently visited the area. Mooring ropes showed fresh wear, and supplies cached on nearby beaches suggested that their treasure hunt was not as exclusive as they had hoped. "We're not the first to arrive," Morrison observed, his tactical instincts immediately assessing the implications. "At least 2 other parties have been here within the past week. The question is whether they found what they were seeking or are still searching." Their small boat passed through the natural channel that led to an inner lagoon of startling beauty. Crystal clear water revealed coral formations and tropical fish that seemed untouched by the outside world, while beaches of pure white sand suggested a paradise that few human eyes had ever witnessed. But the idyllic setting also contained ominous signs of recent activity. A campsite on the main beach showed evidence of hasty abandonment, with supplies scattered and personal belongings left behind in ways that suggested sudden departure under dangerous circumstances. Most concerning were the wooden crosses that marked fresh graves near the tree line. "Other treasure hunters," Morrison said grimly, as they examined the abandoned camp. "They found something, but not everyone survived the discovery." Isabella studied her father's map more carefully, noting additional markings that she hadn't understood before, but which now seemed to indicate specific dangers associated with the treasure's hiding place. Thomas Crown had apparently been aware that the heart of Montezuma was protected by more than just its remote location. The indigenous peoples who hid the treasure didn't want it to be easily recovered, Isabella realized as she decoded her father's warnings. They created defenses designed to protect it from anyone who didn't understand the proper procedures for safe access. Morrison examined the recent graves with the careful attention of someone who had seen too much violence to dismiss obvious warning signs. "Your father's research probably saved our lives by giving us information these other hunters lacked. But we're still facing dangers that 5 years of prison didn't prepare me for." As they prepared to approach the actual treasure site, both Isabella and Morrison understood that they were entering a situation where knowledge would be more valuable than courage, and where their growing partnership would face its most serious test yet. Signs of Red Jack's pursuit were visible on the horizon, creating time pressure that would force them to balance caution with speed in ways that could easily prove fatal if they made wrong choices about the challenges that lay ahead. The entrance to the treasure cave was concealed behind a waterfall that plunged from volcanic cliffs into the lagoon's clear depths. Isabella's father's map revealed the secret passage, but even with his detailed instructions, finding the hidden opening required careful observation and precise timing. They had to dive beneath the falling water during a specific tidal condition, when the cave mouth became accessible without being crushed by the tremendous force of the cascade. Inside the cave, torchlight revealed the first of the ancient Mayan death traps that protected the heart of Montezuma. The elaborate mechanical defense was a marvel of indigenous engineering, a system of counterweights, pressure plates and razor-sharp obsidian blades that would activate if someone approached the treasure chamber without understanding the proper sequence of movements. "Your father's notes describe this exactly," Isabella said, studying Thomas Crown's careful diagrams, while Morrison examined the mechanical trap with professional appreciation. He called it the Guardian's Test, designed to eliminate anyone who approached with greed rather than respect. Morrison traced the intricate patterns carved into the cave walls, recognizing astronomical symbols that corresponded to seasonal changes and tidal cycles. The indigenous peoples who created this understood engineering principles that European architects are only beginning to discover. This isn't just a trap, it's a sophisticated mechanism that requires knowledge to operate safely. The skeletal remains scattered throughout the cave's entrance chamber told the story of previous treasure hunters who had attempted to force their way past the Guardian's test through strength rather than intelligence. Spanish conquistadors in corroded armor lay beside more recent visitors, whose clothing and equipment suggested they had arrived within the past few years. They all made the same mistake, Isabella observed, studying the positioning of the bodies relative to the mechanical trap. They tried to rush forward instead of understanding the system first. Morrison's knowledge of ships and rigging proved essential for understanding the trap's counterweight mechanism, while Isabella's years of studying her father's research provided the astronomical knowledge needed to calculate the proper timing. Working together, they deciphered the sequence of movements that would allow safe passage to the treasure chamber. The pressure plates correspond to constellations visible during different seasons, Isabella explained as they carefully positioned themselves according to her father's instruction. We have to step on them in the order that represents the indigenous calendar system, not the European calendar we're accustomed to using. The process required absolute precision and complete trust between them. Morrison's strength was needed to activate certain mechanisms, while Isabella's smaller size allowed her to reach control points that would have been impossible for him to access. Their partnership, which had begun with mutual suspicion and necessity, now demonstrated the kind of seamless cooperation that could only come from genuine understanding and respect. As they successfully navigated the Guardian's test, additional chambers revealed the full scope of the treasure that had been accumulating in this location for centuries. Gold and silver coins from dozens of different nations filled stone alcoves, while precious gems caught their torchlight in displays of color that seemed almost supernatural in the cave's mysterious atmosphere. But the true centerpiece was the heart of Montezuma itself, an emerald so large and perfectly formed that it seemed to pulse with internal light. The stone had been mounted in an ornate setting that combined Aztec craftsmanship with Spanish goldwork, creating an artifact that represented the collision and synthesis of two completely different civilizations. "It's more beautiful than my father's description suggested," Isabella whispered, approaching the emerald with the reverence appropriate to something that had been protected by centuries of sacrifice and dedication. Morrison stood guard while Isabella carefully removed the heart of Montezuma from its ceremonial setting. But their moment of triumph was interrupted by sounds from the cave entrance that suggested they were no longer alone. Voices echoed through the chambers, multiple people moving with the confidence of those who believed they had overwhelming advantage. "Red Jack," Morrison confirmed grimly, recognizing his former first mate's distinctive laugh among the approaching voices. "He must have followed our trail more closely than we realized." Isabella secured the heart of Montezuma in her leather satchel alongside her father's map and her mother's locket, understanding that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. The treasure was finally within their grasp, but escaping with it would require every bit of cunning and courage they possessed. The mechanical trap that had protected the treasure for centuries was now reset and waiting to deal with the next group of intruders, but Red Jack's forces probably included someone with enough knowledge to navigate the dangers successfully. Their head start was measured in minutes rather than hours, and the cave's geography offered limited options for escape or defense. Red Jack Meridian entered the treasure cave with the swagger of someone who believed victory was inevitable, his cutlass drawn and gleaming in the torchlight. The signature sword was a masterwork of craftsmanship that had once belonged to a Spanish naval commander, ornate silver basket hilt, Toledo steel blade, and a ruby pommel that caught the light like a drop of blood. Morrison recognized the weapon immediately, remembering when Red Jack had claimed it as his share of plunder from their most successful raid together. Well, Marcus Morrison," Red Jack called out, his voice echoing through the cave chambers with mocking familiarity. "5 years in chains certainly haven't improved your appearance. Though I must say, traveling with such lovely company does show better taste than your usual choice of companions." Morrison stepped forward to shield Isabella, his own recently recovered cutlass feeling comfortable in his hand. Despite the years of enforced separation, the weapon was simpler than Red Jack's ornate blade, but had been forged specifically for Morrison's fighting style, perfectly balanced, with a slightly curved edge that made it devastatingly effective in close combat. "Hello, Jack," Morrison replied calmly, noting the positions of Red Jack's crew members as they spread through the cave. "I see colonial service has made you fat and careless. Prison, on the other hand, has given me considerable time to plan for this reunion." The confrontation revealed the full scope of Red Jack's betrayal through words exchanged like sword thrusts. He had not merely sold Morrison to colonial authorities, he had systematically destroyed the network of legitimate merchants and honest sailors who had trusted Morrison's protection. Families had been ruined, communities devastated, and lives lost because Red Jack had provided colonial forces with detailed intelligence about Morrison's allies. "You always were too sentimental about the little people," Red Jack sneered, beginning to circle Morrison with the predatory movement of an experienced duelist. "I simply eliminated inefficiencies that were preventing us from achieving our full potential." Isabella watched the verbal sparring with growing understanding of the personal hatred that existed between the two former partners. Red Jack's betrayal had been comprehensive and calculated, designed not just to eliminate Morrison as a rival, but to destroy everything Morrison had tried to build that went beyond simple piracy. When the sword fight finally began, it showcased the fundamental differences between the two men's approaches to violence. Red Jack fought with flashy technique designed to intimidate opponents and impress observers, while Morrison demonstrated the efficient lethality of someone who viewed combat as a problem to be solved rather than a performance to be enjoyed. The cave's confined space favored Morrison's straightforward fighting style over Red Jack's elaborate sword work. Years of imprisonment had not dulled Morrison's reflexes or weakened his sword arm. If anything, the enforced inactivity had given him time to analyze and refine techniques that had once relied more on instinct than calculation. Isabella proved her worth during the battle by engaging Red Jack's crew members with skills Morrison had taught her during their journey together. She moved with determination rather than grace, using her smaller size and quick thinking to avoid direct confrontations while creating opportunities for Morrison to press his advantage against his former first mate. The turning point came when Red Jack's overconfidence led him to attempt a complex attack sequence that Morrison had seen him practice countless times during their years of partnership. Morrison's counterattack was perfectly timed and devastatingly effective, leaving Red Jack disarmed and bleeding on the cave floor. "You taught me that technique yourself," Morrison observed, as he held his cutlass point against Red Jack's throat. "Did you really think I would forget the weaknesses in your favorite combinations?" Red Jack's defeat was comprehensive, but not fatal. Morrison's decision to spare his former first mate's life demonstrated the moral evolution that had occurred during his years of imprisonment and reflection. Rather than seeking revenge through murder, Morrison chose to let Red Jack live with the knowledge that his betrayal had ultimately failed. "Take your crew and leave," Morrison commanded, stepping back but keeping his weapon ready. "If I see you again in these waters, I won't be so generous with my mercy." Red Jack's retreat was grudging but complete. His crew helped him to his feet and supported him as they withdrew from the cave, their leader's humiliation obvious to everyone present. The psychological victory was perhaps more complete than a killing would have been. Red Jack would live with the knowledge that Morrison had proven superior in every way that mattered. As the sound of their departure faded, Morrison and Isabella found themselves alone in the treasure cave, victorious but forever changed by the experience of facing down the past and emerging stronger for the confrontation. As they sat on the beach counting their incredible fortune, Morrison reached into his sea bag and withdrew a compass unlike any Isabella had ever seen. The instrument was crafted from brass and silver with intricate engravings that depicted maritime scenes around its circumference, but unlike his broken compass, this one was perfectly functional and obviously designed for someone who would command their own vessel. This belonged to Captain Elena Rodriguez, the most skilled navigator in the Caribbean before colonial authorities had her executed for refusing to reveal safe passage routes to their military forces. Morrison explained, placing the compass carefully in Isabella's hand. "She died protecting the same indigenous communities your father was trying to help." Isabella studied the beautiful instrument with wonder, noting how its needle pointed true north with unwavering accuracy. The weight and craftsmanship spoke of an artifact created for someone who would make life and death decisions based on its readings, while the engravings told stories of maritime adventures that spanned decades of successful voyaging. "I don't understand," Isabella said, though her heart was beginning to race with anticipation of what Morrison might be suggesting. "Why are you showing me this?" Morrison's weathered face showed a mixture of pride and melancholy, as he began explaining his proposal. "Because I'm too old to start over as a pirate captain, but you're exactly the right age to begin. The treasure we've recovered gives you resources to purchase your own ship, recruit your own crew, and chart your own course through these waters." The suggestion was so unexpected that Isabella initially thought Morrison was making some kind of elaborate joke. But as he continued outlining his vision for her future, she realized he was completely serious about proposing that she become a pirate captain in her own right. "Your father's research has given you knowledge that few captains possess," Morrison continued. "You understand indigenous routes and safe harbors that aren't marked on any colonial maps. You know which officials are corrupt and which merchants can be trusted. Most importantly, you have a moral compass that would guide you toward justice rather than simple profit." Isabella turned the compass over in her hands, imagining herself standing on the deck of her own ship, with this instrument guiding her navigation decisions. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating, a complete transformation from the orphaned girl who had spent 5 years planning revenge into someone who could shape her own destiny. "What kind of pirate captain would I be?" Isabella asked, her practical mind already working through the logistics of such an ambitious undertaking. Morrison's expression grew serious as he outlined his vision for a different kind of piracy, one that targeted corrupt officials rather than innocent merchants, that protected indigenous communities rather than exploiting them, and that used the freedom of the seas to advance justice rather than personal enrichment. "The Caribbean needs someone who understands the difference between necessary violence and random brutality," Morrison explained. "The colonial authorities have created a system that rewards corruption and punishes honesty. Traditional legal remedies are controlled by the same people who profit from injustice." As they discussed the possibilities, Morrison began describing a network of allies who could support Isabella's operation: reformed pirates seeking legitimate work, honest merchants tired of colonial exploitation, and indigenous leaders who possessed knowledge that could prove invaluable for someone operating outside official channels. "Your reputation would be built on competence and integrity rather than fear and intimidation," Morrison continued. "Crews would follow you because they respected your leadership, not because they were afraid of your brutality. The Spanish called such leaders corsarios justos, righteous corsairs who served higher purposes than personal enrichment." Isabella found herself seriously considering Morrison's proposal as she studied her father's research with new eyes. Thomas Crown had documented dozens of instances where colonial corruption had created suffering that could only be addressed through extra-legal action. Her mother's medical knowledge could be adapted to help communities that lacked access to proper health care. "And what would you do if I became a pirate captain?" Isabella asked, curious about Morrison's plans for his own future. Morrison's broken compass caught the sunlight as he smiled at her question. "I would become your mentor and advisor until you no longer needed such assistance. Then I would retire to legitimate merchant activities, knowing that someone trustworthy was continuing the work that needs to be done." The compass in Isabella's hands seemed to pulse with possibility as she realized that purchasing Morrison's freedom had led her to something far more valuable than treasure or revenge. She was being offered the opportunity to become the person her parents would have wanted her to be, someone who used her advantages to help others, rather than simply seeking personal satisfaction. 3 months after claiming the heart of Montezuma, Isabella stood on the deck of her own vessel reading an official letter of marque that granted her legal authority to operate as a privateer in service to the Spanish crown. The document was an elegant forgery created by Morrison's network of allies, but it carried seals and signatures that would satisfy any colonial inspector who wasn't looking too closely at the details. "This changes everything," Isabella said, studying the ornate calligraphy that transformed her from an outlaw into a legitimate captain with royal authorization to capture enemy vessels and protect Spanish interests throughout the Caribbean. Morrison nodded approvingly as he examined the forged commission. "Your first target should be Lieutenant Commander Blackwood's supply convoy," According to our intelligence, he's been using colonial resources to fund personal trading ventures that violate his official duties. Isabella's ship, the Esperanza, was perfectly suited for the kind of operations she planned to conduct. Fast enough to outrun larger naval vessels, well armed enough to discourage resistance from merchant ships, and crewed by men and women who had chosen to follow her because they believed in her vision of principled piracy, rather than random violence. The crew included several reformed criminals who had served under Morrison during his legitimate years, indigenous sailors who possessed unmatched knowledge of local waters, and former colonial soldiers who had grown disgusted with official corruption. Their loyalty was based on respect for Isabella's leadership, rather than fear of her brutality. Captain Crown, called Maria Santos, Isabella's first mate and another member of the extended family network that seemed to connect throughout the Caribbean. The target convoy is approaching from the northeast. 3 merchant vessels with naval escort, exactly as our intelligence predicted. Isabella's tactical approach demonstrated everything Morrison had taught her about leadership during their months of preparation. She called her crew together to explain the mission objectives, ensured that everyone understood their roles, and emphasized that their goal was justice rather than simple plunder. "We're targeting Lieutenant Commander Blackwood's illegal activities, not the innocent sailors who work for him," Isabella announced to her assembled crew. "Anyone who surrenders immediately will be treated with respect. Anyone who chooses to fight will face the consequences of that decision." The attack on Blackwood's convoy showcased Isabella's evolution from the desperate girl who had purchased Morrison's freedom into a competent captain who commanded through earned authority. Her crew responded to her orders with efficiency that spoke of genuine confidence in her tactical abilities. Isabella's letter of marque proved its worth when Blackwood's naval escort attempted to resist her attack. The legal document convinced several colonial sailors that they were facing legitimate authority rather than criminal piracy, leading to confusion and hesitation that allowed Isabella's forces to gain decisive advantage. "By the authority of His Catholic Majesty," Isabella called across the water as her ship closed with Blackwood's flagship, "I demand that you surrender and submit to inspection for violations of colonial trading regulations." The battle was brief, but decisive. Blackwood's forces were expecting to face ordinary pirates motivated by simple greed, not a disciplined crew operating under legal authority with specific objectives. Isabella's tactical preparation and moral clarity created advantages that proved more valuable than superior numbers or heavier armament. When Lieutenant Commander Blackwood was finally brought aboard the Esperanza in chains, his face showed recognition mixed with disbelief at seeing the orphaned girl he had dismissed years earlier, now commanding her own vessel with obvious competence. "Isabella Crown," Blackwood said bitterly, "I should have killed you when you were still small enough to dispose of easily. You tried to have my parents murdered, and you failed to eliminate the evidence of your crimes." Isabella replied calmly, "Now you'll face justice for those actions and for the corruption you've practiced in service to personal enrichment." The cargo seized from Blackwood's convoy included not just stolen goods, but also documented evidence of systematic fraud involving colonial tax collection and military supply contracts. Isabella's capture of these records provided proof that could expose corruption, extending to the highest levels of colonial administration. "What will you do with him?" Morrison asked as they secured Blackwood in the ship's brig alongside the evidence of his criminal activities. Isabella studied her letter of marque thoughtfully, understanding that her actions would establish precedents for everything that followed. "We'll deliver him to authorities who aren't part of his criminal network. Spanish officials in Havana who have been investigating colonial corruption. Let legitimate justice determine his fate." Her decision demonstrated the principles that would guide her career as a privateer, using her freedom to advance justice rather than seeking personal revenge, even when such revenge would have been emotionally satisfying. On a small island, where her parents had once operated their trading post, Isabella supervised the construction of a stone memorial that would honor all victims of colonial corruption rather than simply commemorating her personal loss. The monument was carved from local volcanic rock by indigenous artisans who understood the significance of creating something that would endure long after current political conflicts had been resolved. The memorial's design combined elements from multiple Caribbean cultures, Taino symbols representing the original inhabitants' connection to the land, Spanish colonial motifs acknowledging the complex legacy of European settlement, and African artistic influences, reflecting the contributions of enslaved peoples who had been brought to these islands against their will. Thomas and Elena Crown. Isabella read from the inscription she had composed after months of careful consideration. Murdered for seeking truth in a world that profited from deception. They died believing that knowledge and justice were more valuable than gold and silver. Their legacy lives in all who choose courage over comfort. Morrison stood beside her as she placed flowers at the memorial's base, his own transformation evident in the way he carried himself as a legitimate merchant captain, rather than a feared pirate. His broken compass still hung around his neck, but now it served as a reminder of hard-won wisdom rather than a symbol of lost direction. "Your parents would be proud of what you've accomplished," Morrison said quietly, his weathered face showing genuine emotion as he studied the memorial's craftsmanship. "You've honored their memory by becoming someone who makes the world better, rather than simply seeking personal satisfaction." Isabella's use of the treasure from the heart of Montezuma had created ripple effects throughout the Caribbean that extended far beyond her own cruise activities. She had established schools for orphaned children, funded medical clinics for communities that lacked proper health care, and provided legitimate employment for former pirates who wanted to reform their lives. The memorial stood at the center of a community that had been rebuilt with Isabella's support, but operated according to principles her parents had believed in: honest trading relationships, respect for indigenous knowledge, and protection for those who lacked the power to protect themselves. Captain Crown called Diego Santos, approaching with a letter that bore official Spanish seals. "Communication from the colonial governor in Havana. He's requesting a meeting to discuss expanding your privateering commission to include additional territories." Isabella accepted the letter with mixed feelings, understanding that her success had attracted attention from authorities who wanted to use her capabilities for their own purposes. The legitimacy provided by her letter of marque came with obligations that could compromise her independence if she wasn't careful about maintaining proper boundaries. "What will you tell them?" Morrison asked, noting her thoughtful expression as she read the governor's proposal. "That I serve justice rather than political convenience," Isabella replied firmly. "My authority comes from the need to protect innocent people, not from the desire to advance any particular government's interests." Morrison's pride in his protégé was evident as he listened to her reasoning. Isabella had learned not just tactical skills during their months together, but also the wisdom necessary to navigate complex political situations without compromising her fundamental principles. The memorial service that followed drew attendees from throughout the Caribbean, former crew members from Morrison's reformed organization, indigenous leaders who respected Isabella's commitment to their communities, honest merchants who had benefited from her protection, and colonial officials who recognized her value as a force for stability rather than chaos. "Isabella Crown represents something new in these waters," announced Miguel Santos, speaking as both family member and community elder. "She has proven that strength can serve justice, that leadership can advance morality, and that the sea can be a place of honor rather than just a realm of exploitation." As the ceremony concluded, Isabella found herself reflecting on how purchasing Morrison's freedom with a single gold coin had led to discoveries that changed not just her own life, but the lives of countless people throughout the Caribbean. Her parents' death had driven her toward revenge, but learning the truth about their murder had guided her toward something more valuable than personal satisfaction. Morrison presented Isabella with a final gift, a small wooden box containing her original gold coin. the same piece that had started their partnership. He had retrieved it from the colonial authorities during one of their raids and had it mounted on a silver chain that would allow her to wear it as a reminder of how courage could transform impossible situations. "Every time you look at this," Morrison said as he placed the chain around her neck, "remember that the most important decisions are often the ones that seem most foolish to outside observers. You had the wisdom to see potential where others saw only danger." The memorial stood as testament to the power of choosing justice over revenge, understanding over hatred, and hope over despair. Isabella had become living proof that even the most terrible losses could become the foundation for creating something better than what had been destroyed. 5 years had passed since Isabella purchased Morrison's freedom with a single gold coin, and now that same coin hung from a chain around her neck as she stood on the deck of her flagship, watching the sunset paint the Caribbean waters in shades of gold and crimson. The coin had been transformed from a desperate gamble into a symbol of partnership that had changed the entire region's balance of power. Captain Isabella Crown was now renowned throughout the Caribbean as the Just Captain, a privateer whose reputation was built on competence and integrity rather than fear and brutality. Her fleet of 3 ships protected honest merchants from both pirate attacks and colonial exploitation, while her network of allies included everyone from indigenous leaders to reformed criminals who had found purpose in serving something greater than personal enrichment. Morrison approached across the deck, his own transformation evident in everything from his bearing to his clothing. Captain Marcus Morrison now commanded a legitimate merchant vessel that traded fairly throughout the Caribbean, carrying supplies to communities that had been neglected by colonial authorities and providing employment for sailors who preferred honest work to criminal activity. "The young woman over there," Morrison said, nodding toward a figure standing near the harbor's edge, "reminds me of someone I once knew, desperate enough to make impossible choices, but with enough courage to see them through." Isabella followed his gaze to see a girl of perhaps 15 years standing beside the slave market, clutching something in her hand while studying the prisoners with obvious internal conflict. The scene was heartbreakingly familiar, another orphan facing circumstances that demanded more courage than any child should need to possess. "Should we intervene?" Isabella asked, though her tone suggested she already knew Morrison's answer. "Some lessons can only be learned through personal experience," Morrison replied with the wisdom of someone who had learned that true growth often required accepting risks that others would consider foolish. "But we can be ready to help if our assistance is requested." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a small boat carrying official representatives from 3 different colonial governments. The delegation had come to request Isabella's assistance with a situation that required both her tactical expertise and her reputation for fair dealing. "Captain Crown," announced the senior representative, a Spanish colonial administrator, whom Isabella recognized as one of the few honest officials in the region. "We have a proposal that might interest you. Pirates operating under false flags have been attacking shipping throughout the region, creating diplomatic tensions between our respective governments." Isabella listened to their proposal with the careful attention of someone who had learned to evaluate political opportunities for both their potential benefits and their hidden danger. The situation they described was complex. Criminal organizations were using the confusion created by multiple colonial jurisdictions to operate with virtual impunity. "What you're describing requires coordination between governments that have spent centuries trying to destroy each other," Isabella observed. "Why do you believe I can succeed where your official diplomatic channels have failed?" "Because you've already proven that principles can transcend political boundaries," the administrator replied. "Your reputation for integrity is recognized by all 3 governments, and your tactical capabilities are exactly what this situation required." Morrison watched Isabella consider the proposal, noting how she had developed the ability to see both immediate tactical implications and long-term strategic consequences. Her response would affect not just her own future, but also the stability of the entire Caribbean region. "I'll accept the commission," Isabella decided, "but under conditions that preserve my independence and protect my crew's interests. I serve justice, not political convenience." As the official delegation departed to begin coordinating their unprecedented cooperation, Isabella and Morrison found themselves alone on the deck as stars began appearing in the darkening sky. The golden coin around Isabella's neck caught the last rays of sunlight, reminding them both of how far they had traveled from that desperate moment in the slave market. "Do you ever regret purchasing my freedom?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested genuine curiosity rather than insecurity about her answer. Isabella fingered the coin thoughtfully, considering everything that had followed from her decision to spend her last piece of gold on the most dangerous man in the Caribbean. "I thought I was buying information about treasure and revenge against my parents' killers. Instead, I found something far more valuable, which was the understanding that courage isn't about avoiding fear, it's about choosing to act, despite fear, when action serves something greater than personal comfort." Isabella smiled as she studied the coin's familiar engraving. "A single gold coin taught me that sometimes the most important investments are the ones that seem most foolish to everyone else." Morrison nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed transformation that exceeded his most optimistic expectation. The girl who had purchased his freedom had become a woman who commanded respect throughout the Caribbean, while the feared pirate had found redemption through legitimate service to something greater than personal enrichment. The coin that had started their partnership would continue hanging around Isabella's neck, a reminder that courage combined with wisdom could transform even the most impossible circumstances into opportunities for creating something better than what had existed before.